My name is Sophia Nahawi, Adult Program Associate at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you for joining us this evening for a special Writers Live with Sheryll Cashin, author of White Space, Black Hood. Sheryll Cashin is an acclaimed author who writes about the U.S. struggle with racism and inequality. Her books have been nominated for the NAACP Image Award for Nonfiction, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction, and an Editor's Choice in the New York Times Book Review. Cashin is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University and an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. A law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, Cashin also worked in the Clinton White House as an advisor on community development in inner city neighborhoods. She is a contributing editor for Politico Magazine and currently resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and twin sons. Joining Sheryll in conversation is Bree Jones. Bree Jones is the founder of Parity, an equitable development company that rehabilitates abandoned properties by the block to create affordable homeownership opportunities. Prior to founding Parity, Bree had a career in finance and investments where she was an analyst at Morgan Stanley, a vice president at Point72 Asset Management, and an investment associate at venture capital firm and Themis Group. Bree has been a lifelong social justice advocate focused primarily on economic justice, affordable housing, anti-displacement, anti-gentrification, and anti-recidivism. And so now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Sheryll Cashin.
Good evening. I really appreciate your coming out to see me this evening. I was told backstage that there's some exception. If you're a presenter, you can take off your mask. And so I feel free. So thank you for joining me. I haven't been at the Enoch Pratt Library for 20 years. My first book, The Failures of Integration, which came out around the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board, I gave a talk here. And it was a wonderful occasion. But I'm sad to say, on the dimension of segregation, a lot of things are worse, not better, in the last 20 years. And so this book, White Space, Black Hood, is really the result of 2 decades of thinking about these issues. And I feel like I kind of brought, I'm a law professor, I'm a self-taught historian, and I have a degree in electrical engineering. And I sort of bring all those skills to bear in giving a systems analysis to this residential caste idea. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview. You're in my class now. I'm a professor. I may call on you. So there may be a test afterwards. Right? But here's the idea that animates this book. Each time we seemed in this country to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, we created another one, right? From slavery to Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the iconic Ghetto, right? And each of these peculiar institutions had a dogma, a negative stereotype attached to it to justify it. Particularly to justify it among people who really weren't necessarily benefiting from the institution. All 3 of these institutions actually conferred unearned value on elites. Now, I lead this book. The very first chapter in the book is Baltimore. And Baltimore inspired me in many ways to write the book. I clerked for Thurgood Marshall. My hero is Frederick Douglass. You know, Baltimore during the Civil War had the largest free Black population of any country, any city, I believe, in the enslaved South. it was those free people working in the port that inspired Frederick Douglass to free himself, right? In the 1890s and the turn of the century, the 1900s, Black people could live wherever they wanted to if they could afford it in the city. They could go into the stores, try on the clothes and hats. They didn't have a regime of Jim Crow, right? It's only when Black people start, frankly, to get uppity, and I feature these two guys who may be familiar to me, W. Ashby Hawkins, who was Thurgood Marshall before there was Thurgood Marshall, right? He was fighting the same battles, both lawyers, brother-in-laws, a Yale-trained man with a law degree, I believe, from the University of Maryland. I may be wrong about that. But it's when Ashby Hawkins buys a house on McCullough Street and allows his brother-in-law to rent it. It's on one of the finest blocks in the city that Baltimore begins to try to create through racial zoning, residential segregation, and the history goes on from there, right? And I show these two guys fighting it, right? And, you know, Ashby Hawkins runs for the Senate in 1920, saying things that you can see Black political candidates saying today about how Black people pay their taxes. The party that they were loyal to then, the party of Lincoln, takes their votes for granted, and they're not getting their fair share in their schools, in their neighborhoods, you know. But anyway, what I do is show, I use Baltimore to tell the story of American residential caste, showing that, you know, the dominant response to Black people, the 6 million odd Black or more Black people who fled Jim Crow, North, Midwest, and West, was to contain them in their own neighborhoods, then redline those neighborhoods and cut them off from the kind of resources that were regularly, public and private resources that were rained down on white neighborhoods, right? And I show generations, I use this term as a term of affection for the Black American descendants of the enslaved. I call them descendants, all right? Particularly, I use that phrase for Black Americans living in high poverty Black neighborhoods. I'm a descendant, by the way. I don't live in a high poverty Black neighborhood, but all four of my grandparents descend from American enslaved people. But I show from Ashby Hawkins and George McMechen forward generations of descendants in this city resisting the cumulative blunt force trauma visited on historically redlined Black neighborhoods in the city. I'm sure you know the colloquial phrase that Lawrence Brown has popularized, the black butterfly and the white L. Well, it didn't just happen in Baltimore, it happened everywhere, right? 200 cities in this country, virtually all Black neighborhoods, with some rare exceptions, were redlined, marked with a D, hazardous. And there was a study released by the Fed in 2019, which went back and looked at all of the neighborhoods nationwide that were marked with a D. And they found that 8 decades on, it's that decision correlated to this day with and continued disinvestment, right? So what I show in this book, this is the follow-on institution. So in the chapter about Baltimore, but throughout the book, I have a very quick history of this cumulative blunt force trauma: redlining, then exclusionary zoning, urban renewal, James Baldwin calls Negro removal, discriminatory public housing, the concentrating of public housing in the wings of the butterfly, highway construction, no other neighborhoods in Baltimore or elsewhere were subject to this cumulative trauma. And what I say is, you're familiar, obviously, with this, right? And then, to underscore the point that the past is not past, Baltimore jumped out at me as the obvious example of residential caste because of Hogan's decision to rescind the red line, right? I don't have to, other places I have to tell them of that story and people are like, what? You know, you're familiar with the story, so I won't rehearse it. But I say in the book that there are 3 present day anti-Black processes that animate residential caste. And what is residential caste? As a general matter, we have a society which through government policy overinvests and excludes in affluent white areas and disinvests, contains, and frankly preys on people in high poverty, Black neighborhoods in particular, and then tell stories about the people in the hood to justify that system, right? Well, there are 3 main anti-Black processes of residential caste: boundary maintenance, polite phrase for segregation; opportunity hoarding, that's the overinvesting and disinvesting; and surveillance. And these are some of the policies. When Bree and I have our conversation, we can get into more details. And this is just my opener before the conversation, but I'll say in the final chapter, after I've laid these processes out, I have a final chapter called Abolition and Repair. And Bree and I will talk about what that means and looks like. But the first step of abolition, which I call for, is trying to get government and society to change the nature of its relationship with high poverty Black neighborhoods and the descendants who live there, to change the lens from presumed thug to presumed citizen, and to see those folks as assets capable of being agents in their own liberation, right? And when I was writing this book or finishing this book in 2020, I thought that the hardest step in my thought process about abolition was this first one: getting people to see Black Americans as 3-dimensional human beings worthy of care, right? And then this summer happened, right? Then poor George Floyd's assassination happened. And I was heartened by the 20 million odd people who rose up and put these signs up. And I still believe, despite the backlash, that Black Americans have more allies than they've ever had in American history, but we need to organize the multiracial coalitions that can pursue abolition and repair. And I'll stop there so we can begin the conversation. And again, thank you for coming.
Well, beautiful opening, Sheryl.
Thank you.
You make my job as a moderator easy. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you tonight. My name is Bree Jones. I'm the founder of Parody. And before we get started, just want to say thank you to the NAACP Library for the invitation to speak with you tonight. So Sheryl, the first question I'm curious about is, what was the inspiration and the impetus that led you to write this book?
So I graduated from Harvard Law School a long time ago And I was invited in 2018 to give an endowed lecture there. And it was actually, I'd given lots of lectures, but it was very intimidating to go back to my alma mater and give a lecture where some of my professors were still there. It might be an audience, right? And it really forced me to think ambitiously. What will I say, right? And I was very influenced by Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and the way she related mass incarceration, a modern institution, to the continuum from Jim Crow, you know, and I had come to believe that residential segregation was a caste system with intentional oppression, the same kind of intentionality that animated Jim Crow. So that first slide, which showed the continuum, that was sort of the central idea of the lecture, right? And then once I had done the lecture and really spent 6 months thinking about it, I said, I think this is a book. And the more I got deep into this, and this is coming off of really 2 decades of researching this, the angrier I was getting, you know. And there's so much competing dogma. We were talking about myths backstage, right? The biggest myth in American society is that high opportunity living is earned, and that hood living is the deserved result of individual bad choices. And so I just set out to tell the truth and shine a light on it, and have the reader understand what I had come to understand.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me, you know, you mentioned that both of your grandparents are descendants of
All
American,
4 of them.
Yeah, American enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of tell me a little bit more about your background, your journey, your experience with what you've written about?
Yeah, so I come from a very activist civil rights family in Alabama. I mean, to give you a sense of it, right? My mother took me with her in her arms when I was 4 months old and got herself arrested at a sit-in in Huntsville, Alabama. Now, I should say, Huntsville, the police were not violent. They would kind of just stand there and they were very polite. That's where they were in the race to put the man on the moon. So they didn't want to be too, upsetting to Washington, right? My father started an independent Democratic Party in Alabama at a time when the regular Democratic Party was dominated by George Wallace. And he ran for governor against George Wallace. They kickstarted the Second Reconstruction State. I grew up with that kind of activism, and I wrote a memoir about this. But my great-grandfather was a Reconstruction legislator, right? So, my father got activated by hearing stories about his grandfather during Reconstruction. Then I grew up in pre-civil rights America, and then I experienced post-civil rights. My brothers and I were integration pioneers. I spent 12 years in public education in the time when the South was trying to make good on Brown and it was getting more integrated. But my father had to get a white couple to use their money to buy into the high opportunity neighborhood that they wanted their kids to get schooling for. So we had lived with a lot of these issues. And then, as I've gotten older, I've realized that the same schools that I went to, the high school I went to, which is a very well integrated, well-resourced high school, became so impoverished, they shut it down, right? And so, I kind of weave in, basically the story of this book is that every generation of Black Americans, people have had to decide, am I going to be part of the resistance? And a lot of people are. And so my resistance is writing about it. But we've lived different generations, different forms of racial oppression. And I'm very aware of that long history.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked how you showed the continuum of basically white supremacy and how it's evolved from slavery to Jim Crow to ghettos, because the white supremacy as a system requires a scapegoat, it requires an other, and that's what they've that's how Blackness has really been framed and created in this country.
Right.
So that was a really interesting take on or like representation of that spectrum. So you throughout the story, you really integrate anecdotes, or throughout your book, you integrate anecdotes, you integrate stories of people who are directly living through this experience. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about like why you chose that literary style?
Right. Thank you for that question. I do have literary ambitions, right? This is my 5th book. I have worked very, very hard to write, I'm just going to say it, literary nonfiction, right? To write in, beautiful sentences, but to engage the reader, to pull you forward. I read all the time. But to be honest, I was very impressed with how well Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, did. Have you read it? Any of you read it? I mean, runaway bestseller. It's like, it just boggles the mind. I never would have thought a book that's really about housing segregation and the oppression of Black people would be such a runaway bestseller. And I was just trying to understand it. And I decided it's so story driven, right? Just like Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, very story driven. So I tried to be over in telling stories. And I start each chapter. I showed you the beginning characters for the chapter in Baltimore, right? But every chapter features a descendant, opens with that person's story. I also wanted to humanize my people, right? I wanted the reader to see my people the way I was taught to see my people. My father, he just believed Black people were capable of anything if given the chance. And he was just as honorific and caring about dirt poor Black sharecroppers in West Alabama. He lived in North Alabama, was a dentist. This guy spent all of his money, personal money, engaged in desegregating politics for dirt poor Black people, right? Because he just believed in their greatness, right? So I thought that it was important to humanize my own people in the telling of stories as part of the project of getting society to see what I see when I see Blackness. I see beauty. I could just go on and on and on, right?
Yeah. Well, it really does show through in your work.
Thank you.
So similar to how you and your father have these innately held stories and views of Black folks, you also talk a lot about the myth of like the mythology of Black folks, or the mythology of the ghetto.
Right.
So can you kind of unpack that a little bit more?
Right. You alluded to this idea about how white supremacy needed Blackness,
right?
A negative. And I showed that on the very first slide, right? That actually in academia, there's this school of theory called social dominance theory. And I was reading some of it, but basically in social dominance theory, the idea is that almost all societies have social hierarchies. This is the book Caste gets into this, right? But you need, and that you have like origin stories and myths to support the predominant social structure, right? And in the United States of America, there are people who want to resist this, but white supremacy was the central organizing principle for hundreds of years in the North and the South, right? So whiteness is constructed and insulated. You can't marry across whiteness. And then, you had whiteness in the Jim Crow was a system of social control, right? In the North, the Midwest, the West, instead of having Jim Crow as a means of social control, they have residential mechanisms, right? Residential separation, where you need ideas to justify it, right? And so I have an entire chapter on what I call ghetto mythology. And the chief participants in that, the chief purveyors of it, have been presidents and presidential aspirants, right? And you'll be familiar with this, right? Law and Order, welfare queen, super predator, thug, right? And that, the most vulgarly transparent of all was the Donald Trump, right? Did you notice, like, whenever he talked about Baltimore, it was always, and when he would get in these, the great Elijah Cummings, comported himself differently. But, it's like, why don't you go back to your rat-infested, violence-infested? He did the same with John Lewis. But when he talked about inner cities, he would always use infested, violence-infested. He would, and he cast himself in the summer of 2020. I showed the sign. While most people, I shouldn't say most people, many people are out in the streets trying to do some racial reckoning peacefully, right? He cast himself as the protector of the white suburban way of life, and he's explicit about it, and tweeting about it. You can thank me. I've rescinded Obama's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. You get to keep your suburban way of life, and your crime will be low. Your housing values will go up. Thank me. This is the president of the United States openly saying segregation to insulate white suburban space. That's my policy, which is actually a violation of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. You got the president of the United States saying this, right? So, and you pick up any debate about affordable housing or Section 8 or vouchers or desegregating schools, and it's not hard to find coded and sometimes not so coded language. And people don't want to say it, but ideas about Black people and fear of Black people is what's really animating it. There's also some worse ideas, the very, like Washington, D.C., which is supposed to be a progressive city. I give the example in the schools chapter. You can find on Capitol Hill 2 schools within 1 mile of each other. One of them is overwhelmingly Black and overwhelmingly poor. And a mile away is a majority white school with very few poor kids, right? This is in Washington, D.C., which is supposed to be progressive. And the good liberals, and I'm sure there are a lot of good liberals voting Democrats, would probably riot if the school system tried to change those attendance lines to create some racial and socioeconomic balance between them. So they don't.
Yeah. So we spoke earlier about, for those good liberals, for the well-intentioned white
Well, there was a podcast, nice white parents.
Yeah. And the well-intentioned liberals and how they kind of inadvertently had some detriment to their Black counterparts that they were looking to help or assist. But what's the role of white allies in this work? Is it integration of schools? Is it reallocation of resources? What's their role?
Well, in the final chapter, Abolition Repair, I invoke W.E.B. Du Bois, who used to live in Baltimore for a while. He was here, where he says we need to construct an abolition democracy, acknowledging that you can't get abolition of any system of racial oppression if you don't have a functioning democracy that demands it, that supports the dismantling of whatever the structure is. Back then, when he was writing, it was the color line, racial caste. I'm writing about abolition of residential caste. But I say that it's possible, and I cite examples, particularly in progressive Democrat-run cities, to have a functional multiracial majority that supports some of the policies I talk about. And so one role of white allies is to join that coalition, right? And joining that coalition requires you to practice pluralism, right? The idea, and I talk about this is, I coined this phrase in my previous book, which is Loving, which is about interracial intimacy, but cultural dexterity. And I talk about the growing swath of culturally dexterous whites. What the culturally dexterous white person? Someone who enters a very diverse room without the fright or flight reaction, will go to the PTA meeting and see a lot of diversity in the room and say, well, I can accept that. I want to be part of this PTA and be in it in the dialogue, and I won't always get my way. There may be a number of different cultural norms about, pick the issues, right? We're tracking or, but I want to be part of the coalition that makes this school get good for all the kids in this place, not just my own kid, right? So that's what being an ally is. Entering this fray, supporting policies that may demand more of you than you're used to having, right? That you may end up give the example of what de Blasio tried to do with the elite test-in schools in New York City, right? A bewilderingly diverse city where everybody's paying taxes, but Black and brown kids were really being shut out of the 8, 10 test-in schools, right? And people get really, really upset about it, right? So there's an example where inclusion, it doesn't mean that white people won't get to participate, but it might mean that it's harder for your kid to get there, right? It might mean, but your kid's probably going to be okay, right? So, I have twin sons. My greatest accomplishment, I'll tell you now, my greatest accomplishment is to have a very successful marriage to a wonderful man and these beautiful fraternal twin 15-year-olds who are doing well, who love themselves and are thriving, right? It's a lot of work. And we were in public charter schools in DC for 7 years. But when I participated in those schools, I never brought in an attitude that I'm in here fighting for what's good just for my kid. There were a lot of poor kids in these schools, right? That's I try to think it's being committed to something beyond just yourself.
Mm-hmm. And when it pertains to white allies, it's also important that they're willing to be led by folks who are closest to the issue and be led by Black people. And
when it comes to, in abolition and repair, I argue for a number of things, but I say that historically defunded Black neighborhoods deserve priority in public spending. That, if you read the book, I think it's pretty clear the moral case for it, right? In Baltimore, despite having a lot of Black representation, when they actually looked at the numbers, they found that they were spending 2 to 4 times as much in white neighborhoods as Black neighborhoods. Well, racial equity might mean, if you live in a majority white neighborhood, that you may get less next year for, pick your community project, right? There's an example. But also when it comes to trying to transform historically defunded places, of course, the people who live there need to have agency and leadership, and they should be the ones who are leading the charge there, not people from outside.
Right, 100%. Mm-hmm. So, Sheryll, I want you to get a little bit more granular. Mm-hmm. You kind of underscore a 3-part process mm-hmm. to what I've been calling the hoodification of Black neighborhoods. And so one is opportunity, hoarding, boundary maintenance, and surveillance.
Right.
Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Well, let's do the boundary maintenance first. In fact, I have my notes, and I'm a little mentally tired because I've taught class today, and I had a radio interview, and now I have you lovely people. I'm doing my best, but I have to look at my notes here because here's the historical boundary maintenance. I've kind of listed it. Racially restrictive covenants. Exclusionary zoning that limits where multifamily buildings can be built. In many large American cities, it is illegal to build anything other than a single family detached home on as much as 75% of the land. Okay, you know what class of people that supports, right? To the exclusion of everybody else, right? So that's exclusionary zoning. Urban renewal projects, intentionally segregated public housing, the highway. So I hit those, right? And then endemic redlining and disinvestment by the city and the state in basic services in Black neighborhoods, such as schools and sewage, roads. That contributes to boundary maintenance because those places aren't nicer because of disinvestment, and that contributes to avoidance, particularly by non-Black people. And what happens is people tend to associate the conditions there with the people who are living there. You know, people don't see that it's decades of disability. Okay, so fast forward today, granular policies that support poverty concentration to this day. Low-income housing tax credit, the largest public subsidy the federal government has for building affordable housing. They channels about $10 billion a year into affordable housing. Only 17% of the units built with that subsidy is in high opportunity places, right? In many cities, I feature Houston in a little case study with a map, right, in the book. You can see, I have a map with the stars of where the low income housing has been built. In the Houston area, it's all outside of the majority white areas, like not almost no affordable housing. And this is what I'm talking about, boundary maintenance. And you can find shocking, in some cities, you can find, like infamously in St. Louis, affluence right across the boulevard, right across Delmont Boulevard from the hood. You know, they're like literally right across from each other, right? So, you know, cities actually continue to invest in those boundaries, spend money in ways that encourage rather than discourage these systemic boundaries. So that's boundary maintenance.
Okay.
Right. Opportunity hoarding. I've told you that they did an analysis of where all the money for capital projects were going in the city. And they found that they were spending twice as much in white areas as in Black ones in this city. Then when you add private investment, you've had all these like state enterprise zones and what do they call it? Opportunity zones, right? With loopholes such that higher income areas that are adjacent to the hood qualify for tax advantages, right? Surprise, surprise, a lot of these luxury developers are getting the benefit of it, and the actually distressed neighborhoods are not, right? City of Baltimore gives over $600 million in tax increment financing for this Port Covington, right? $600 million for a project, you know, envisioned by a billionaire, right? Who could easily go and get his own financing, you know, or put some of his own money into it. That's an opportunity cost, right? That $600 million in foregone revenue might be used to stimulate investment somewhere else, right? So that's examples of opportunity hoarding. The biggest example, you know, so The people who are excluded from high opportunity places, and you guys know where they are, right? You could name some names, right? The majority of people in the metro areas are excluded. They are subsidizing the golden infrastructure you tend to find in these places with their tax dollars, with their sales taxes, with their income taxes. And you know, it's like they're getting more than their fair share. And the last stat I'll give you, like, this country spends $23 billion a year more in majority white school districts than majority minority school districts that educate the same number of children, right? That's opportunity hoarding. It's like, you know, okay, we have our boundaries. This is our tax base. You can't come here. You can't buy your way in here. We have no multifamily. You can't access these schools. You know, that's opportunity hoarding. The surveillance, I won't spend time on. People are familiar with that. Right?
Okay, yeah, and I wanted us to go deeper into this opportunity hoarding and boundary maintenance as it pertains to high opportunity areas versus, I guess, hoods, ghettos, low opportunity areas. Raj Chetty,
Right.
from Harvard,
Right.
received a lot of, publicity, I guess, a year or two ago around his studies that when children and families have housing opportunity and school opportunity in high opportunity areas, economic mobility is increased. And I'm wondering what that means for those left behind. So if we export people into high opportunity areas, what does that mean for the ghettos and the hoods? And before you answer that, I want to pull forth a passage from your book that really resonated with me. So for anyone who has the book, it's on page 203. It says, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, geographer, scholar, and prison abolitionist, writes of carceral geographies, mainly the prison industrial complex and its phalanx of extractive practices, and calls for abolition geographies to negate them. Abolition geography, in quotes, starts from the homely premise that freedom is a place. I love that. Freedom is a place, she writes. The hood, now this is in Sheryll's words, the hood, as I've described in this book, is an enclosure, a place with an operating logic of confinement, surveillance, disinvestment, and dislocation from opportunity. Thus, while abolition requires dismantling these anti-Black processes, it also requires the creation of new relationships to place and land, to resources, and to one another. So how do we reconcile that high opportunity areas are an opportunity to escape poverty, but also we want to create abolition geographies and freedom as a place?
Right. So first I want to say, sadly, Baltimore has one of the lowest rates of social mobility for poor children in the country on Raj Chetty's index, right? And this is why I choose caste to describe. There's almost no social mobility if you're in what demographers use the word ghetto for a neighborhood where 40% or more of the people are poor, right? And this is more about the system set against them than the people who live there, right? So, but the communities that are high, the cities that are high on Raj Chetty's, that have, high or decent social mobility for poor children, what are some of their features? They tend to have less rigid segregation. They tend to have more affordable housing and interspersed among middle-class people. They tend to have a kind of robust, good government, civic culture, a lot of support for schools, and lower levels of prejudice, right? It correlates with that. Now, I think it is exceedingly hard to transform a concentrated poverty neighborhood into a bastion of opportunity. Why? Because the state is probably not willing to spend the money that would be required to do that. And I'll just stick with schools, right? Social science shows that the number one predictor of a school's performance is the socioeconomic background of the kids. No surprise there, right? But there are some examples of academic excellence in high poverty, but it tends to happen only when there's a very, very reduced ratio of adults to children, almost like Dan Lew, 1 adult to every 4 children, right? How willing is the state to give what some people call apartheid schools, to give high poverty Black schools that level of intensive investment, right? So that said, I argue while we're fighting the battle of school integration or breaking up castes and making all neighborhoods have their fair share of affordable housing, while we're fighting that long battle, I do think that you have to make the moral case for racial equity and prioritizing investments and care, what I call a new infrastructure of opportunity, right? So people in high poverty neighborhoods should be first in line for school lotteries to excellent schools, right? If you don't have the money to do a universal basic income for everybody, try a UBI pilot in the concentrated poverty neighborhoods, right? Make the bus routes free from the highest poverty neighborhoods. There are things you can do in acknowledgement that you have systemically cut off opportunity. I hope that's responsive.
Yeah, it is. It is. I appreciate that. And just one thing I'm realizing in my work as a housing developer is that, because I think about schools all the time, I'm not an education expert, but what I realize is that in order for the schools to be healthy, the households that the children go back to also need to be healthy. And that's a derivative of healthy and safe housing, but also, as you just talked about, income and
but resources at the school.
So it has to be multi-sectoral and comprehensive. So we received a few questions from the audience, and this is kind of on the heels of what you were just talking about. So someone wrote, and this is actually 2 questions, but I think they tie in well together. Is the principal roadblock to African American equality institutional zero-sum game? So is the roadblock to African American equality a zero-sum game, i.e., if you gain, I lose, the if you gain, I lose myth? And kind of as a follow-on, is there kind of a role that the media can play in shifting some of these myths or ideologies that we hold?
So that's definitely the myth that animates 5 decades of dog whistling. You see it so often in, civil rights, the civil rights movement, allowing Black people to sit where they want and go, that was even, or even, just be considered for jobs that they had been totally locked out of. That was played by cynical politicians. Remember Jesse Helms on that Senate campaign? You deserve that job. They saw the white hand crumbling the rejection notice. Definitely, that is an idea that has been out there stoking white resentment. It's definitely there. What role can the media play? Nicole Hannah-Jones says this a lot. I'm not a journalist, but I think she was right. I was listening to her on Terry Gross coming in, driving here on a podcast. But the idea is that journalists, in the effort to appear objective, act as if both sides of the political spectrum are sort of equal opportunity. But one side is actually doing really nasty, racist things. I can say that. She can't necessarily, journalists can't say that way, right? But she was talking about how
journalists of color often have a perspective of cynicism because of this history I'm talking about, and lived with it. So I think journalists, for a long time, for example, Trump would lie every day. Just like, truth was just not in his vocabulary. But it took a long time for journalists to just start saying he's lying. That's, it's not true. It's a lie, so I think just tell the truth. I unfortunately, I think we've gotten to a point now where truth and facts don't matter to a lot of people, but still, but telling the truth and trying to debunk myths. Now, even though I've suggested that being a white ally could involve some self-sacrifice, I will say that I truly believe that breaking up residential caste, and I'll say the beauty of, once you understand residential caste and these processes, the way forward is very clear. You just do the opposite. So you green line historically defunded neighborhoods rather than opportunity hoarding. You have inclusionary zoning rather than exclusionary, and you bring a lens of care rather than stereotypes based on negativity and fear to descendants. And that frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that actually might be cheaper, right? And I give some examples of neighborhood safety strategies that reduce gun violence by half, that were a teeny tiny fraction of mass incarceration and just dragnetting every Black neighborhood. So the point is, a society that's premised on inclusion and care might be less expensive to the taxpayers, and more and people of all colors would probably find more housing opportunity. They get to live in places that where they might have more comfort and less pressure to spend every dime they have to move into the highest opportunity neighborhood they can. I think society, it would lift up all people.
Yeah. And there's in like critical race theory, there's this belief, I guess, or just like understanding that white supremacy also dehumanizes white people. And once, I think, like to your point, once the collective realizes that actually like holding on to these antiquated social models actually isn't benefiting me, and I'm kind of when the collective is brought down, that also means that like my ability to live a full, healthy, happy life is also sacrificed, even if in the moment it feels like, oh, my kid is going to the school I want. But a child that was withheld opportunity in a Black neighborhood could have been the future doctor to cure cancer that your white child is suffering from, for example. So having that broader context of what could be when everyone has collective opportunity, hopefully that'll start to shift some of the systems and mental models. But kind of on that point of greenlining neighborhoods, there's a really well-written question about the red line. So the question says, there is much that is lamentable about Governor Hogan's cancellation of the Red Line project, forfeiture of $900 billion in Fed matching funds.
I think it was 900
million. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
900 million in Fed matching funds, dismissing 15 years of research and development and stakeholder buy-in. Would you speak to the characterization of the Red Line as a handout to undeserving Black folks, as opposed to Montgomery County's Purple Line being couched in terms of a long overdue project?
Oh, don't get me started. But yes, let me say this. So yes, the Red Line, it was really more than 15 years in the making. They'd had a paper plan for this since 1965. And again, it's anti-Black dogma, loot rail. That was, it was called loot rail, not light rail, loot rail. Like if suburbanites, like you let this come, they're going to come, steal your car, it was all this stuff, right? But this red line was going to connect some of the poorest neighborhoods in East and West Baltimore to job centers. Only 2% of the jobs in Baltimore are in these poor neighborhoods. By definition, if you want to work, you got to get up and go somewhere else. And in a number of these neighborhoods, as many as 40, maybe as much as 40, 45% of the people were carless, right? And, it takes like 90 minutes by the bus. I did come here and ride the bus with someone, my God, it's slow, right? Could take 90 minutes to do it, to get to Amazon fulfillment center out of the perimeter, right? It would have been a 20-minute car ride, right? So, Republicans particularly lecture Black people about, you go get a job. So people who actually want to, it's, they're transportation dependent, right? What does Hogan say? That this was a wasteful boondoggle. That's what he called it, a wasteful boondoggle, right? And what does he do? He returns $900 million, and he says it's poorly thought out. 15 years in the making, right? Advisory neighborhood, committees in all the states, brilliant ideas for community renewal, led by the ideas of people who were going to actually live there, right? Connecting people to the new jobs that were going to be created, transit-oriented development, and it was finally going to unify the city, right? And give it a restart. And not to mention it's good for the environment too, right? And people of all colors wanted this, right? So what does he do? He returns the $900 million grant and then reallocates 100% of the more than $700 million that was earmarked for the first stage of the Red Line to outline road projects in majority white areas. And one investigative reporter found that his own real estate company was poised to benefit from that. And meanwhile, although he grudgingly accepts the purple line, lets it go forward, and it's connecting the most affluent white suburb, majority white suburbs of the district to the metro, right? Particularly suburbs that the state has already spent $2 billion to build a lightly used intercounty connector. People who they have their cars, right? And it's just patently, that's not a boondoggle, right? The road projects, a lot of them weren't even, it's just patently devaluing Black people and their needs and overvaluing white people. And it's just an outrage.
So we're almost on time. So I want to
and it also violates civil rights law, and I write about that too. They managed to evade having a finding about that, about whether it violated civil rights law. Okay.
Well, that is probably a really good segue into our last question. This asker says, writing one book, much less 5 books, is an enormous feat.
Thank you.
Did you find or encounter any pushback from agents or publishers during the publishing process? And I'll tack on this last question. What's next?
Oh, goodness. Okay. So it's been quite a journey for me. I had a very fancy agent at a very fancy literary agency represent me with my first 2 books and got me a book deal, some decent money, not these like really ridiculous, but some decent money. And then I kind of hit a wall because I didn't write a runaway bestseller, my memoir. was critically acclaimed, but didn't sell that much, right? And so it's always, these for-profit houses, they always want to know how your book did. The second book didn't do that well. And this fancy agent did not succeed in selling my third book idea. And then she kind of just dropped me. And she said, race books don't sell. This was so funny now. Like now there's so many of them that are like runaway bestsellers, I was before my time. And then Beacon came along. My publicist from Beacon, Bev Rivera, is here. Wait. She went to St. John's. Johns Hopkins. What am I saying? Johns Hopkins. I apologize. So I kind of stumbled into Beacon, which is not-for-profit press, backed by the Unitarians, right? Hyper liberal, but we kind of met accidentally. I met an editor there, and they liked a book idea I had, and they basically have said to me, "We'll publish any nonfiction book you want to write." I did want to dabble with fiction, and that there was like, "No, we're not going to publish any novels of yours," but I decided to go for the career and put aside the money and the agents and all that, right? Because if you get a big advance, you got to sell enough books to get it back, But I can do that with a very modest advance that Beacon pays. So I've cried alligator tears, but I'm still here, and doing okay.
And what's next?
What's next? Let me breathe, child. You're a child to me. This book almost killed me. It was a labor of love, but because I was really shining a light on things that a lot of people may not want to hear, I made myself, there's thousands of endnotes. I supported with evidence every single claim I had. It was a lot of work. Yeah. And so I'll wrap it up real quick. I'm a contributing editor to Politico, and I enjoy writing kind of like it's short to me, 3,000 word pieces. Same ethic of like really supporting what I'm saying, but they're very happy with me. And so in the next year, I just want to write some pieces and essays where I'm meditating on ideas that might find their way into the next book. But I just my hope is that I can get to the point where somebody would want to publish an essay-like book about what the 21st century inclusive city looks like, and maybe I'll come and see what you're doing.
Yeah, come back to Baltimore, get your inspiration. Hopefully. They say that if there's any city in this country that will be like the launch pad for social equity, racial equity work, it's Baltimore City. So with that, I want to please join me in thanking Sheryll.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Sheryll and Bree, for joining us this evening,
Thank you.
for giving us so much of your time, answering questions, and being as honest and direct as we expect and we love from both of you. For those of us watching virtually and those of us already in the audience as well, if you haven't bought Sheryll Cashin's book already, please go out and do so. There are a limited amount of signed book plates from the Ivy Bookshop, so buy them if you haven't already. And thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us this evening as well. Please join us on November 30th for a virtual panel discussion on the reissue of Lucille Clifton's family memoir, Generations. And with that, we're going to sign off for the night. Good night, take care, and stay safe.
Give me your address. I'll mail you a sign.